I've got an action-packed presentation for you all and tried to pack it with as much artwork as I could. So, yeah, without further ado, let me just say briefly that, just as a synopsis of the talk, that my goals are kind of twofold, that I want to show you a variety of artwork across our collection. And while I'm not physically there and you're not either, want to get you excited to go there and also to explore our virtual programs, of which there are plenty every week. And many of them are free. So more on that later. And then secondly, this talk broadly is about the collection of the museum and specifically about some of the personal stories behind some of our iconic collection works. And I want to introduce you and tell you more about some of the key movers and shakers who have played formative roles in shaping our permanent collection since the time the museum was founded, but also more recently. So we're actually going to look at three formative bequests, which are art collection gifts, major art collection gifts from Bertha Palmer, which was gifted in 1922, from Martin Ryerson in 1933, and also more recently from Stefan Edlis and Gail Neeson, who gave us a tremendous contemporary art gift in 2015. So that's actually where I want to start. And so while we are not physically there, I thought what would help transport us there, going to come back to my presentation, but I have queued up a clip from a documentary called The Price of Everything, which I highly, highly recommend this documentary. Maybe some of you have already seen it, but there's a clip, it's just under 3 minutes of Stefan Edlis and Gail Neeson walking through the modern wing of the Art Institute. This is shortly after the museum has received their gift in 2015, and it's now on the walls of the modern wing. So let me just let this clip play for a couple minutes, and then I'll come back to you. And I have my sound, by the way, up to max. So if you need the sound higher, there's also captions, but if you need the sound higher, please try to turn that up on your computer. So here we go.
Donation for the Art Institute of Chicago. The museum says it's the largest gift in its history. 42 iconic pieces of contemporary art.
It's estimated to be worth about $400 million. The gift includes 9 works by Andy Warhol, including 12 Jackies, Flowers, and Liz number 3. The president of the Art Institute said in a statement, "We are so grateful to Stefan and Gail for the extraordinary gift. It allows us to build one of the richest narratives of art under one roof."
Oh, too close, too close. So beautiful, this sculpture, the heart shape that it makes.
You have to come close to see the glitter. There's glitter there.
You've given this incredible gift to the museum. Why?
Well, the simple answer is no grandkids. We had conversations with the museum, and I said, you know, I'm going to give you a picture and it's going to end up in storage. That's not good enough. So they said, we're going to clean out existing gallery, and it'll stay up like you want for 25 years in the gallery and another 25 years mixed up, but still up.
Seeing it here today, do you miss it at home?
All the walls are full. No more room at the inn. No, we make
nice
sure
to see
that we
it
don't
here.
miss it. If we really miss it, we can come down and have another look.
Now tell me about the Liz.
That's the only partial gift. Well, I gave the Liz a 10%, but I said, I just got it. I'd like to live with it. You can have it for 6 months. I'll have it for the rest. Meanwhile, get me a poster, get me something. And then Gail came back with an exact copy, including the wrinkles in the canvas. So we're happy with the copy. Let them have the real stuff. It's amazing what technology can do now.
Doesn't this raise a little bit of a question, though, too, about even what is a piece of art, if it is reproducible like that?
You absolutely, you put your finger in the wound. That's it. What is a piece of art? Absolutely, that's a question. I can't answer it, but I certainly agree with you. Looks good there, doesn't it?
makes you feel like you've done something. Everybody would like to think in life that they've done something.
I'm sad that.
Okay, so I hope that the production values on that was frankly quite a lot better than if I was standing at the museum trying to broadcast to you. So hopefully that made us all feel a little bit like we were physically walking through the museum. And hopefully some of those galleries are familiar to some of you who have been to our museum and to the modern wing before. So here on this slide, I have just I have a screenshot from the Chicago Tribune article online about the massive gift transforming the Art Institute. That's from 2015 and shows Mr. Edlis standing in front of Liz number 3, the Warhol piece. And then the same piece, I'm actually not sure if that's the original or the facsimile copy in their Gold Coast home that, you know, you can kind of see them living among their art. And I think one of the best things about this documentary is to see what it looks like for a wealthy collector and philanthropist to actually be living among these multi-million-dollar works. It's very remarkable, and I'll actually say a little more about that. But just briefly to give an overview about the Edlis Neeson collection, which is basically the whole second floor of our modern wing. Again, it was 44 pieces spanning from 1953 to 2011. And at the time they gifted it in 2015, it was valued at about 400 million. And Mr. Edlis, he was born in Austria in 1926. And when he was 15, his family escaped wartime Austria to the United States. And it was just before the departure routes from Europe were shut down by the Nazis at the time. And so he came over with just an 8th grade education and found odd jobs in factories in Brooklyn before being trained as a tool maker. And in 1943, he was drafted and he spent a couple years in the Navy during World War II. Eventually, he made his way to Chicago in 1950, and he would go on to found a company called Apollo Plastics, which made parts for Zenith radios, record players for RCA, Motorola flip phones, and eventually the parts for the dashboards in vehicles. And he was doing quite well by the 70s, and that's also when he began collecting art. And he went on to sell his company in 2000, again, made the gift in 2015, and he passed away in 2019. So just a bit about Stefan Edlis. And some of these works you'll recognize from the clip, hopefully. So I want to just, honestly, this whole collection is filled with contemporary art superstars, but I've just selected a few for us to look at individually. And this one is Untitled or Bolsena by Cy Twombly. And I'll give you a few seconds just to kind of look here. And I've chosen Twombly partly because he is a bit of a controversial artist. There's sort of two sets of people, and you know, all his work he's known for the synthesis of drawing, painting, and writing that is mostly abstract, but also mixed in with certain suggestive pictorial elements. But there's sort of two people tend to fall into two buckets. They either look at this and they're super confused. Why is this art? You know, my 3rd grader can do this. I hate this. And then the second bucket, which I kind of identify with myself, is it doesn't really bother me that it's abstract and I don't totally know what's going on. I basically just like it, and there's a refinement and sophistication and allure to the abstract composition that I'm looking at. And you know, it's always a mysterious thing why one piece of art makes someone hate it and then another person adore it. But I think Twombly is fascinating for this reason. And so in this case, the time that this piece was made gives us a little bit of a clue of the context. So some folks in the audience may know that a significant event happened in the summer of 1969. That was the Apollo moon landing. So knowing that helps us a little bit start to decode and unpack what we're looking at. And this context helps us recognize some of this visual language as talking about measurement. And, you know, with the kind of, it almost sort of looks like a heavily revised with all the erasing that's happening and all the pencil marks and numbers. It almost looks like a revised math worksheet. Um, and so in the documentary and elsewhere, Edlis has talked about, his process for choosing artists to collect. And he says they spent 20 years trying to decode Twombly. And finally, when he concluded he would like a Twombly for his collection, and this applies to his collecting of every artist in his collection, was he not only wanted just any Twombly, but he sort of wanted the Twombliest Twombly he could find, basically a work that really epitomized the artist's style and approach. So, he had various opportunities, different Twombly pieces would come to market. And then when this one came along, he felt, this is the Twombly I've been waiting for, the sort of most fulfilled or most realized of the artist's vision. And then a really fun thread with Mr. Edlis is that, I mentioned he was trained as a tool maker, and he was not at all shy about maintaining or fixing his artwork, his multi-million dollar artworks. And I think, if I had a few $1 million and bought a piece like this, I might be afraid myself to touch it and handle it. And I would probably, if I had spent that much on it, I would probably just hire a professional to take care of it for me. But not Mr. Edlis. He talks about one night, and this is reported in the Chicago Tribune. He was looking at it and he thought, it needs something. Home Depot's open. It's 1 a.m. It's a 24-hour Home Depot. So he rushes over to Home Depot and buys these wood frame pieces to make basically a custom wood stretcher to put the canvas on, and then he mounts it onto the stretcher. And I'm just like, that's great. More power to you that you have the confidence to, it's your artwork, you own it, and he calls it his midnight framing caper. So yeah, and here's something a little different. We caught a little glimpse of this in the clip too. This is I think we would call it a sculpture or maybe an installation piece called Still by an artist named Damien Hirst from 1994. So what we're looking at here is a careful clinical arrangement of medical instruments, and perhaps it's a bit fetishistic. It's maybe taking on even sinister elements of just these kind of medical, surgical, laboratory equipment pieces. And it's backed by a mirror in the rear. So when you stand in front of this piece, you see all kinds of reflective images in both the mirror as well as the shiny surfaces, meticulous surfaces of these objects. This piece is inspired by a 1988 film called Dead Ringers by David Cronenberg, which is a psychological thriller about twin doctors. From what I hear about it, it's not a film I'm going to rush to watch anytime soon, but if that sounds like your thing, it's a lot of body horror apparently, definitely check it out, and that might give you more insight into this piece as well as the inspiration. But Damien Hirst, he was an important artist, part of a cohort of the Young British Artists, or YBA. He's also known, you may have heard of him putting sharks, cows, basketballs in formaldehyde and putting them, encasing them in glass cases. And those pieces selling for phenomenal amounts of money. And his work is sorted along with Jeff Koons, who we saw in the clip as well, as sort of very sensational, very flashy, and sort of as the sort of inheritors of Andy Warhol and post-pop art. So another example of Edlis Neeson collection. And then continuing to show the range, here is a Jasper Johns, one of 3 in the Edlis Neeson collection, which I adore this work, and I made a special little trip a couple days ago in preparation for talking to you all to just see it again. It's a very sculptural painting. It features the full alphabet here. Johns was doing a lot of alphabet pieces, just using letters from the alphabet in his paintings. But this is the only example that actually shows the full alphabet from A to Z. And I can't recommend enough. This is in the modern wing. This is actually quite a small painting. Johns is, more famous for his Target, which is in our collection too, in the Edlis Neeson collection. But you can see in this detail, it's made with encaustic and paper mounted to hardboard. So encaustic is like pigment mixed with wax and has a very putty, like you can see this kind of like physicality to it that's not the same as normal oil paint or acrylic paint. It's very sculptural, it's very small, but it really draws you in. And I just think I lean in as close as I can when I get to this piece, and alarms will go off if you lean too close, but this is one of those pieces that I just love to admire the actual sculptural detail. And then the last work we'll look at in Edlis Neeson collection here, this is, I have a few images by Cindy Sherman, part of her Untitled Film Stills series. So you might have noticed so far we've been looking at mostly male artists, and that's reflective of the fact that Edlis Neeson collection is dominated by male artists, but there are 2 female artists, including Cindy Sherman. So she was born in New Jersey, 1954, and ended up going to New York City for art school. And she began taking images where she herself, this is the artist playing the subject or the protagonist, if you will, in the image. She was imagining herself as a B-movie actress for movies that didn't exist. And she would dress herself up in a variety of costumes for the role, the imaginary role, for this Untitled Film Stills series. In the 1970s, she was among a cohort of women artists that was really questioning female archetypes that existed, in popular culture. And here I have a couple more. Here's another one, same, the artist again, just transforming herself with different accessories, props, wigs. She loves wigs, has a weird wig collection. But yeah, what kind of pulls all these together is the cinematic composition that uses lighting, costuming, styling, and props. That there's something about it in the backdrop. It's inviting you to fill in this narrative of what's going on with this figure, and pick up on the clues that tell a story. And I have the first 2 are on view. Not all of our Cindy Sherman pictures are on view just because we have so many of them. Here's a couple more. One on the left, I think, is just, she's really leaning into like, this is weird, I'm weird, get used to it. But she, in this gallery, again, in the kind of suite of Edlis Neeson works, she's next to an artist named Richard Prince, who, if you're familiar with Richard Prince at all, it's a totally different energy. There's very sexual pinup Playboy like images of women, at least one of which is totally topless. And so it's this juxtaposition, because they're roughly contemporary, of images of women made by a man versus by a woman that elicit very different effects, and just kind of make you question who's making the image, what is it made for, who is it made for, whose gaze, and questions like that. And Cindy Sherman is, over the course of now 4 decades, has been continually making images that address these issues in visual culture about gender, performance, and identity, and continues to just release bodies of work that just continue to interrogate those questions. So to wrap up with Edlis Neeson collection, I have this slide here showing again Mr. Edlis with his wife, Gail Neeson. This shows you all the artists, mostly, almost, yeah, I think it's 14 artists, almost entirely male, except for 2, Cindy Sherman and Katharina Fritsch. Quite a few Americans, a few Europeans, and 1 Japanese artist, Takashi Murakami. So this is to show you the remarkable, these are headline contemporary artists, all in a single collection, single private collection that, again, if you come to the Modern Wing, definitely check out on the 2nd floor. And I hope I've been able to show you some of the range of what's in there, and, share more of kind of, I like the clip that was shown too, because it kind of showed Mr. Edlis's sense of humor, and that, he's not just like a collector coldly amassing assets and investments, but someone who is really getting into the dynamics of the art. And if you can't get to the Art Institute anytime soon, thankfully this collection is going to be up for 25 years as a whole, intact until 2040. So that should be plenty of time to go over there and check it out. And then at a certain point, they will enter into our permanent collection. So I doubt they will ever be displayed kind of intact as a collection again, but they'll just kind of be absorbed into the larger pool of works. So just as we move on, I think some of the threads I would hold on from talking about this collection and thinking about Stefan Edlis is just this mix of, you know, him collecting out of personal passion and to some extent with some advice from professionals and following the art market, but just one of the threads that'll carry us forward through the other collectors we'll look at is just confidence and personal taste and sort of the idiosyncrasies of each collector. Okay, we're going to take a breath and get ready to do a little bit of a time hop because we're actually going to go back over a century. This is a view of the Art Institute's permanent, it was actually technically the Art Institute's third home, but the first permanent home that was built for it on Michigan Avenue, which is still part of the museum's campus today. If you enter on Michigan Avenue through where the lions flank the stairs, that building, we call it the Allerton building, after one of our other benefactors. But here we see it being constructed. You can still see the south wing under construction in this image. So we're going to go way back in time. We've looked at a very contemporary example, and now we're going to kind of be much closer to the early years of the founding of the museum. So kind of like a 30-second anchoring for where we are in history. In 1871, there was the Great Chicago Fire that leveled much of downtown. Then at the end of that decade was the founding of the Chicago Academy of the Fine Arts, renamed to the Art Institute shortly thereafter. And it took a few years to kind of gain traction. It was a number of kind of local business people and philanthropists who really wanted Chicago to become more than kind of a trading post, wanted it to become like London, Paris, Rome, and New York, the great kind of metropolis cities of the world, a capital for culture, as well as for, you know, economic trade. So the occasion that came along that the Board of Trustees for the Art Institute really leveraged to create this permanent home for us as a museum was the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, also known as the World's Fair, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with in one way or another. But there was a lot of hustling and a lot of, you know, brokering to get this land by the lakeshore to be the permanent home for the Art Institute. So even just looking at this picture, which as probably many of you know, the museum has expanded 5-6 times with new wings since then. But even then, this is a pretty large building. And, you know, in 1892-93, the museum really didn't have much of a permanent collection to speak of. So there was a question of, you know, you might think there's a museum, it's filled with art, but where did the art actually come from? They had the building, but what were they going to fill it with? So in the initial years, the first, you know, really decade or two of the museum, you would see a lot, if you had been there, we had been there, we would have seen a lot of plaster cast replicas of classical sculptures. So this is coming in off the Michigan Avenue entrance. I believe, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this would be like the doors coming in from Michigan Avenue. And I can picture it in my mind's eye because I was just there. Then on this side is one of the gift shops now. And then there used to be this really large octagon desk where you would check in. And then the coat check and stuff would be behind where this view is. But anyway, yeah, so you would see all these kind of plaster casts, which was really the bulk of the collection in the early days. So not originals, but replicas made of plaster. And here's moving along some more. So we're coming through that lobby and coming to this grand staircase off the Michigan Avenue entrance. And again, seeing more casts. And, you know, it really took, this was not unlike other major museums like the Met in New York and also Museum of Fine Arts in Boston that were around in the early days of kind of American museum culture. It really over time evolved to where museums became a place that housed original art um, and masterpieces as opposed to these kind of replica works. So in these early days, again, when the museum had no permanent collection of real merit to speak of, the way that it worked was that many of the rooms in the building that we saw, the Allerton building, they were sort of more or less earmarked for prominent philanthropists and families. So, you'd have the Buckingham room or the Palmer room, and, things were cycling in and out on loan from wealthy collectors who were lending on short-term loans works from their private collections. So it was almost like that room or those rooms of the museum was an extension of their private homes where they would display their favorite works. Oops, sorry about that. My cell phone. So it took until, this building was built 1893 for the World's Fair. And it was well into the 20s before the museum started to have a permanent collection that was kind of merit, thanks to the fact that people then started making generous gifts to the museum. But from that time and all the way through today, it's easy to see the more you learn about these works. Our collection really is it's a collection of other collections. And yeah, we're looking at some of these stories today. So next we'll look at Bertha Palmer, who some of you may be familiar with. Bertha Honore Palmer, nicknamed the Innkeeper's Wife. That is from a popular book called Masterpieces, Famous Chicagoans and Their Paintings by Patricia Ahrens. So I'm borrowing the nicknames from Ahrens. But so in this kind of second half of the talk, we'll look at Bertha Palmer and Martin Ryerson, who in the very early decades of the Art Institute, there was a constellation of really important collectors and philanthropists, but I would say that these two separately were major standouts in this constellation of philanthropy. So Mrs. Palmer, a few things, because I find the social history of the Palmers really interesting, and some of this may be familiar to you, is that she married Potter Palmer, who was 22 years her senior in July of 1870. And he was a merchant magnate who had founded the dry goods store Potter Palmer and Company, and would go on to become the largest landowner in Chicago. He, like many of the sort of businessmen and merchants of Chicago, was born on the East Coast. He was born in New York, and then ended up coming over to Chicago because he and the others sensed that this was kind of the frontier. This was where the place to be to make your fortune and become very. His sites on State Street in the 1860s, bought up as much real estate as he could, and his intention. I'm getting a little note that my internet connection is iffy, so Kate, feel free to let me know if I need to repeat anything. But so Potter Palmer had his sights set on State Street, and he built a block. He developed a new shopping area with 32 stores and houses of business, and had all these innovations with reference to customer service and returns. And then he also was ambitious and created the Palmer House, which was his goal was to create the most fashionable hotel in Chicago that the city had seen. And on the occasion of his wedding to Bertha Honore, presented it to her, his new bride, as sort of a wedding present. And it was valued at $3.5 million in 1871 dollars, which I'm sure is a lot more than that in terms of the conversion now. But so unfortunately, though, guess what happens 2 weeks after the Palmer House opened? The Great Fire hit Chicago, and the whole building, was, along with much of downtown, was leveled. So Mr. Palmer, being a resilient man, he borrowed $1.7 million from his insurance to rebuild, and then 2 years later was able to reopen the second iteration of Palmer House. This time they made sure to use fireproof materials. So by the 1890s, the Palmers were really at the top of Chicago society. He was king of the merchants and she was queen of the high society socialites. So she, a little bit unusually, was pretty politically involved for a woman of her time. And she joined the Democratic Party, and at the age of 27, even ran for alderman of the 21st ward. And so, as noted here on the slide, she was also appointed president of the board of lady managers for the World's Fair, which the purpose of this board was essentially to show the progress made by women all over the world, in the form of various exhibitions and programming at the World's Fair. And so for the fair, she actually declined the salary that came with this position and traveled on her own dime across Europe to meet with dignitaries, to meet with art world individuals, make connections that would strengthen the exhibit that she was working on, multiple exhibits for the World's Fair, because her ambition was really to use the fair as a chance to show off like progressive and first-rate art come to Chicago, in and of Chicago, but also well beyond from Europe, and not just have it be kind of a safe run-of-the-mill art show. So we're going to look at some of the pieces she acquired, but I just want to say briefly that this is a portrait of her by Anders Zorn. To me, I had thought it was a John Singer Sargent, but it is because Zorn was aspiring to paint like Sargent, the well-known society portrait painter. And this, for a long time, this portrait was in the Ryerson library, the library that's inside the museum. But during the past few months, it was finally reunited. This portrait of Mrs. Palmer was reunited with some of her beloved Impressionist works in the Impressionism galleries on the second floor, not too far from the Michigan Avenue entrance. So just to say about this portrait. So showing again, different but similar to Edlis Neeson collection, full of just iconic works and gems. So as Mrs. Palmer is touring Europe, she's making connections, building the buy-in for the World's Fair in Chicago, but she's also snapping up what would become just sort of like the masterworks of Impressionism from that period. And so she bought people like Renoir, Monet when they were not fashionable. They were in fact sort of like renegade peripheral artists, and it was kind of risky to be going in that direction. There was no guarantee. They're certainly not as established as we think of them today. So she bought a number of these paintings and worked with a gallerist named Paul Durand-Ruel, who was the agent for Manet, Monet, and Renoir. And Durand-Ruel would go on to say that those painters absolutely would have starved if not for the American patronage they received from people like the Potter Palmers. And I wanted to put in, especially, we've got two Renoir paintings here near the lake on the left, and Acrobats at the Cirque Fernando to the right. The Acrobats is also known as Circus Girls. It's been labeled with different titles throughout its history for various reasons, but that was actually her personal favorite, Circus Girls, and it was always hung in her bedroom. And one thing I loved reading about Mrs. Palmer is that she loved her art so much that as she traveled, which she did often, she would have some of her favorites shipped with her so that wherever she was staying abroad, her favorite artworks could hang with her. So it was like bringing a little bit of home with her. So also she purchased Circus Girls for the amount of $1,750 in 1892. And by the time of her death, a couple decades later, it was worth $200,000. So we got to talk about Monet, not least because we have a current Monet exhibition up now through June 14th called Monet in Chicago. This is a piece from Potter Palmer collection that's early Monet. And I personally really enjoyed this work because you can see it's not, for those of you familiar with Monet, it's not quite, the height of Monet yet, but you do kind of see him reaching for those pictorial strategies where he's using this high key color palette and, impressionistic paint strokes. And it's really a departure from what was the accepted style of the time, which was the sort of high academic salon style of realism, of history painting. And so this, this kind of painting made in 1868 was shocking and definitely not what people were used to at the time. So Mrs. Palmer, back to Bertha, she, she was buying up impressionists left and right, again, at a time when it was somewhat risky, and then lending a number of the pictures that she had bought to the World Fair exhibition down on the South Side. And she was very influential in at least two ways. One, in that all the work she had put in alongside other people to kind of show off avant-garde art in Chicago, did seem to confirm that Chicago was shedding its provincial past, and that it was indeed becoming, this kind of cosmopolitan city that could one day rival London, Paris, etc. And then with her own works of, lending Barbizon pictures and Impressionist pictures to the show, she was very influential to the sphere of philanthropists in Chicago and inspired others to buy these artists as well. So, and that certainly helped those artists in terms of their livelihoods, but also eventually, as I have been alluding to, in 2-3 decades from the time they were buying them, all of these paintings, many of them would go to the Art Institute and form the basis of what would become our collection. And to say a little bit that Bertha Palmer, she certainly had confident taste of her own, but she did receive some good advice from folks like Sarah Hollowell, was a curator and art dealer who worked with her on the World's Fair exhibition. And Hollowell was friends with artists like Cassatt and Rodin. And also Mary Cassatt was directly in touch with many collectors, including Mrs. Palmer. And, since she was an artist herself, she sort of was whispering in their ears about, oh, so-and-so is hot, like so-and-so, you should collect them. So, it wasn't, I think that certainly confidence and personal taste was a part of it, but did have some input from the likes of Sarah Hollowell, Mary Cassatt, for example. A couple more on the Potter Palmer collection. Here's another Monet that's in the show, the Petite Creuse River. And I don't think we can make it out quite in the photo on the top left, but I wanted to include that picture of the way that the pictures were shown in Bertha Palmer's own home. Just to kind of, I just love to see how people live with their work, kind of like juxtaposing with that one of the Warhol in the Edlis Neeson home earlier. And we would probably never hang the works like that at the museum for various reasons, but I find it very charming just to see how people live with them, just how they enjoyed seeing them. And by the way, so this was in the Palmer's Gold Coast home. They also more or less jump-started the Gold Coast as sort of the place for high society to live, because at that time the South Side was where all the fashionable society were, and where Gold Coast is today was basically marshland. So Mr. Palmer, he rolled up his sleeves and set about draining the marshland, and then began to sell parcels of property to his rich friends, who started building their homes north of downtown as opposed to the South Side. So quite the trailblazer. So this is, I think, my last Potter Palmer slide, just to show you images of Mr. and Mrs. Palmer on the left and right. And then also this pair of marble busts, which the busts are on view, sculpted by Hiram Powers. And just to kind of conclude on the Potter Palmers, that their collection had so many headline names from French painters as well as Americans that are still, if are only more beloved now than they were at the time. And she, Mrs. Palmer, was also somewhat adventurous. I don't have any of them in this presentation today, but she collected also Tanagra terracottas, ivories, Tang Dynasty figurines from China, pottery and jade, more pottery and jade from China. So she did have, different tastes, but it's the Impressionism galleries that bear her name. if you go to see the Impressionist galleries, their names are on the wall, and for good reason. And just to conclude by saying that, so Mr. Potter passed away in 1902 after they had been married for 32 years. And at that time, he left his entire property to Bertha with no strings attached. And so when people were warning him, oh, she might remarry, he answered, if she does, he'll need the money. And so actually her collecting did slow down a lot after he passed away, though she did continue to accrue objects from time to time. And then when she died 16 years after him, she actually left a fortune double what he had left her in 1902. So indeed, she was a very prudent investor, a very savvy investor in the arts. And in 1922, the Palmer bequest came to the Art Institute 4 years after Bertha passed away. And again, with the Mary Cassatt, the Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, Renoir, and Monet, of course, they're among our most visited works today. And, you know, again, to kind of underscore that these works were absolutely far from being mainstream in taste when they purchased them. And then as kind of a fun segue, because these are marble busts, I couldn't help, not necessarily a segue so much as a throwback to earlier, I couldn't help but think of this marble bust from the Edlis Neeson collection that we saw in the clip by Jeff Koons. And this is just for fun, that, you know, I think it's wonderful that there's something for everyone at the Art Institute. You like marble busts? Well, you can see something like this. You can also see something like this, you know, within a short distance walk from each other. And this, by the way, is from the Edlis Neeson collection. Jeff Koons, his first wife, Ilona Staller, was featured in a lot of his works at the time. And she's a former adult film star, politician, and singer. And, you know, in their own ways, it's two distinctive portraits of married couples, right? Different taste levels, certainly different periods of cultural context. So lastly, we'll look at Martin Ryerson, The Quiet Gentleman. And he's contemporaneous basically with Bertha Palmer. And he's remembered as an astute and discriminating collector who remains to this day probably the single most important donor in the history of the Art Institute. So of course we have to talk about him with reference to collecting. So Martin Ryerson, he was born 1856 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he ended up inheriting a really large fortune that his father made in the Michigan lumber trade and in Chicago real estate. So before he hit 30, he was able to use his inheritance to more or less retire from business entirely. And he turned his focus to support his true passions, which was cultural and educational institutions. And the Art Institute being, of course, a big benefactor of his efforts. He was elected a trustee in 1890. And it's hard whenever I talk about Ryerson, I really have to also mention Charles Hutchinson, who you see on the left here, in his mid-20s, maybe early 20s. He was the first president of our board of trustees and served until his death. And the reason I always think of them two together is that they were very good friends. They became very good friends through their work with the Art Institute. And while our board of trustees was always kind of a close fraternity of business and personal ties, there was a really extraordinary friendship that existed between Hutchinson and Ryerson that everyone recognized and knew about. And they were nicknamed the Committee of Two. And here on the right, they're pictured with their wives, Carrie Ryerson and Martin Ryerson on the left, and Charles Hutchinson and his wife to the right. Her name is escaping me. But yeah, so for over 3 decades, the two of them worked together to make major acquisitions on behalf of the museum, and that really pivotally shaped our collection in its really early stages. And similar to Ryerson, Charles Hutchinson inherited a fortune through his father's business, which was tied to the Corn Exchange Bank. And I think it's worth noting that the generation that Hutchinson and Ryerson were part of, kind of, coming into their own in the late 80s, early 90s, 1890s, they were really part of a generation that they were the sons and daughters of the old roosters or the kingpins of commerce of Chicago. And their families were by that point so fantastically wealthy that there was no need for them to be part of industry necessarily. So they really enjoyed a lot of freedom and social advantages, the ability to kind of pursue their true passions, which in the case of these two gentlemen was, arts and culture and education. So I do have a couple of fun pictures here of the Hutchinsons and Ryersons traveling together. So I loved learning that every year, I assume it was winter, since that's the best time to get out of Chicago, they saved time to travel together as as the two couples, and they would make annual journeys abroad where they were traveling as friends, but also establishing connections and making acquisitions on behalf of the Art Institute. So they visited most of the capitals of Europe. They went to Russia, and sometimes they had other people with them. Like when they went to Russia, they went with the first president of University of Chicago, William Rainey Harper. And they went a little, I don't know the exact location of this photo, but I assume it's somewhere kind of warm and maybe tropical. There's also this image in Japan. There's Hutchinson and there's Ryerson there, going along in the rickshaws. And they did go further than Europe. They went to British India, they went to Burma, Hong Kong, and Japan. And the Ryersons in particular really loved Japan, and they stayed there for a while and actually made a number of purchases that turned out to be handsome curios as opposed to kind of museum worthy, high quality objects, which it took time to kind of realize that. And continuing with looking at travels, here's a photo that I know is in our current Monet show of Martin Ryerson kind of in the center front there, visiting Claude Monet at Monet's home and his famous gardens in Giverny in France. And that was in June of 1920. So, Ryerson went as an agent of the museum in the hopes of acquiring more of Monet's paintings. By 1920, certainly Monet was, had gone from being kind of outsider, renegade artist to Monet, French national hero. And by 1933, when Ryerson made his gift to the Art Institute, it included 16 paintings by Monet, many of which are featured in the current show. And I just, again, back to the artwork, got to get back to the artwork. This is one of the pieces in the show from the Ryerson collection, and my absolute favorite, probably because I lived in London for a year, so the Houses of Parliament pictures have a special place in my heart. But as some of you may know about Monet, he would paint the same subject matter. At a certain point in his career, he was basically just choosing the subject matter, but painting it over and over again, dozens, sometimes hundreds of times, just for different light effects and feelings. And Houses of Parliament, I think that he also would destroy ones that did not meet his high standards. So he might have made, let's say, a couple hundred of this subject, but then destroyed all but 20 to 40 that actually he felt were, of lasting quality. And this one that's on view now is just, I don't, it just strikes me as just gorgeous. I love the colors. I love the quality of the light that you see of kind of sun setting, or maybe it's sun rising, I'm not sure, but the light over the Houses of Parliament, it's wonderful. And then another star piece from Monet, the water lilies from the Ryerson collection. You can, I think, barely make out that it was a personal favorite of Carrie Ryerson. Again, love to see how these collectors lived with their works. And so, every morning when she woke up, she'd see this painting, which is quite nice, I think. A few more slides before I wrap up of Ryerson collection. So we've got more Renoir, Woman at the Piano here on the left. I've been wanting to do a talk when we get back to the museum where we play music while we look at this painting and just be able to take it in. Which, by the way, we should be, everything's virtual still now, but we should be going back in person as soon as this summer, and definitely by the fall, I would say, knock on wood, with everything getting better. Then on the right, we have a Mary Cassatt print, Woman Bathing. Oh, and I do want to say that with the exception of this print and one other print, because prints have very specific stipulations on how long they can be exposed to light, and then they have to rest for many years. Almost everything I'm showing you is on view right now, but not the prints, because there just needs to be long wait periods between when prints are shown. And so Ryerson collection definitely has big strengths in the old masters, in Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, but also in American painting, such as Winslow Homer. So you would see these in Arts of the Americas. Winslow Homer, just briefly, he was known for a series of paintings of the sea, and very iconic in American art. He made them when he moved to Maine, and it's just exploring this theme of man and nature, the age-old contest of man and nature, humankind with nature, the heroic efforts of fishermen doing their daily work, daily labor, hauling in this catch of herring. And all these pictures, of which this is one example he made, talk about the elemental struggle against the sea that both gives and takes, nurtures and deprives. Another American who I've touched on, John Singer Sargent, from the Ryerson collection. This one is Venetian Glassworkers. And I think, if you like looking at painting at all, I just think it's always such a pleasure to look at Sargent, because he just makes it look so easy. It drives me nuts. Having done a little bit of painting when I was in college before I changed over to printmaking, it is just not, you could have this in front of your canvas and try to paint like this, but it's just not, it's not easy at all to paint this way. And I just always love looking at Sargent work for just his virtuosity, and yeah, it drives me nuts too, but he's wonderful to look at. And then just to kind of wrap up, a couple more from Ryerson collection. A print by Hokusai, who I believe many of you will know from The Great Wave, his most internationally renowned image. This is one from the series, different series called 53 Stations of the Takaido, and it's a color wood block print. And so someone like Ryerson would have known at the time that he was acquiring this print that there was actually a lot of exchange conceptually between Japan and Europe by late 19th century, in that, and by that I mean that Hokusai, he would have been looking, as Japan was opening up more and more in the 19th century and receiving more foreign imports, Hokusai was looking at things like Dutch painting, Dutch copper plate prints, and being a little bit influenced by kind of European work. But then conversely, the Impressionists, who Ryerson collected, as well as Palmer, they were hugely inspired by Japanese prints and sort of the compositional approaches that Japanese printmakers were using, which was so unlike kind of the European academic style that people in France would have been used to. And then this is the last object I'm showing you today, again to show the range of the Ryerson collection. This is a Lacquer Tea Bowl, and in Chinese, let me bust out my Chinese here, Qianlong Yuzhi Diaoqi Zhan, which means basically Emperor Qianlong carved lacquer cup. And this would have been from, one of Ryerson and Hutchinson's joint travels abroad. And I wanted to end on this object for a couple reasons. One is to let you know that, if you don't already know, that on every object label in the museum, there are typically the last couple lines will give you some of this information, the credit line and the acquisition number. So in this case, the credit line, gift of Martin A. Ryerson and C.L. Hutchinson, refers to these two gentlemen that I've been telling you all about, and alludes to just seeing this line, it's about their friendship, about their travels together, and conjures that relationship as to the reason why this object is part of our collection. And then the last line, usually on the object label, is called the acquisition number. So the way to read that is the 1888 is the year that the object was acquisitioned into the permanent collection. So if it's on loan, if it doesn't have an acquisition number, it's not in our collection. But if it has that number, it means it's officially, belongs to the Art Institute at this point. And then the second number is means that this tea bowl was the 165th object to be added to the collection in 1888. So that may be a little bit of inside baseball for some folks out there, but I think the longer I've worked at the museum, the more intrigued I am to kind of see different names pop up here and there, and where you start to see them across different galleries. But yeah, so I wanted to kind of end with this object because it's a symbol of friendship and of the social relationship between Ryerson and Hutchinson. And just as to try to tie it all together, that a reminder that the objects in the museum carry with them so many personal stories. And a lot of times they're linked to, idiosyncrasies of the people who bought them and collected them. And that, we might be tempted when we go to museums to see it as some sort of like objective experience that a nameless force or some kind of scientific process led us to seeing these works that are on pedestals and, worthy of being at the museum. And that, in fact, there are many personal stories and personal and social relationships that brought these objects to the museum to be part of the permanent collection, and some of which I've tried to illuminate for you today. And the museum is, so full of objects, but in less tangible and less obvious ways, these objects contain cultural and social history over, many years, many decades of our history. So I think with that, I'll say thank you for joining this Saturday. Thank you again. I do hope we'll see you at the museum or at virtual events coming up soon. That I have a couple links here because Kate had mentioned that folks might have questions about, what to expect when visiting and what events are coming up. So those two very short URLs will, the visit page, there's some great innovations we've made over the prompted by the pandemic. Like I remember our last show, the Warhol show, which some of you might have gone to, there was literally a line from the door of the Warhol show going practically to the door of the museum, and you had to stand in the line to enter the show. But now with a show like Monet or Bisa Butler, which is also on view for a couple more months, you just add your phone to the waiting list and you can walk around, look at anything you want, go out, get a cup of coffee, whatever, and you get a text message when it's time for you to enter. So I mean, how great is that, right? No one has to stand in the line anymore. So the visit page, the reason I say that is the visit page actually gives you real-time wait times for special shows. And also, the other things that I'm sure won't surprise you, such as required mask wearing, social distance that continues to be required. And then also, hopefully my internet's saying it's iffy again. The events page has all of our events, and most of them are public. And so they're all still virtual at this time. But as I alluded to earlier, we're very optimistic, especially in time for the Obama portraits, which are coming this summer. I think they open in mid or late June. We're very optimistic to be able to step back into the world of in-person programs, starting as soon as summer and definitely by fall. And I've also put my contact info on here. You've heard a lot from me, but if you have more questions, comments, or anything to share or ask of me, I'm happy to hang out for a few minutes now with Kate and Roz. I think some questions have been coming in, so definitely fire away.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Nancy. That was a great presentation. It was great. You got lots of compliments already, so we truly appreciate it. If you guys are still out there, when I close the webinar today, just a quick reminder that there's going to be a short survey that pops up. It's like 5 questions long. If you have a few minutes, you could fill it out for me. I'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, it will also be included in the follow-up email that's going to come out to you. But since there are so many of us still here, we can go through a couple of the questions for a few minutes here.
Great.
I thought this was a funny question. How does an artist like Cy Twombly become famous in the first place?
I love that too. And I hope whoever asked that can come to the Twombly talk whenever I finally do it. Because I imagine it being set up as like a almost like as a debate, right? Because I mean, as a person who I never try to tell people what to feel about the art, you know, if you genuinely hate Twombly and it makes you angry, like it does my husband, I actually think that's better than being apathetic about a piece of work, because I feel like there's a lot of things you probably just will walk right past in the museum and you don't really feel anything about it. So in my opinion, feeling anger or resentment towards an artwork is actually better than feeling nothing. And yeah, and then of course that's a rhetorical question that I can't actually really answer, except to say that that artist just has that effect on, I don't know what it is. I look at it and I think it's wonderful, and it's, it has an effect on me that I want art to have. But I know plenty of people who look at it and just, I can see the like steam coming out of their ears, like, what is this? But whoever that was, please look out for my Twombly debate talk and come.
Awesome. Is the display cabinet of the surgical equipment, which I believe was like the second or third piece you showed us, is it a 3D piece or is that a photograph?
Oh yeah, it's 3-dimensional. It's 3-dimensional. So it's like a physical case. Sorry if that wasn't clear. And did I mention that Mr. Edlis, as part of his like fixer hobby, he would unscrew the doors and like just clean the objects, and it was he talks about how fun he thought that was.
Oh, so they're not affixed to the shelves then? You can move them around in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the case is actually like screwed shut. Like it's not designed to like just open and function. But again, Mr. Edlis, being as hands-on of a collector as he was, he would just get in there and, probably like lovingly clean the dust off, which I think is hilarious.
Cool. Did the Palmers have any children?
Palmers, that's a good question. I think they did. Because if I go back, well, let me go back. I would need to look it up to tell you specifically, but in the credit line here, it says it's a gift of Gordon and Janice Palmer. So my assumption, which I need to corroborate by looking it up, is that they had descendants, who received some of the work and then continued to give it to the Art Institute.
Okay. Is there a relationship between Ryerson and the Ryerson Woods in Lincolnshire? Not sure if you'll know that one either.
Oh, I don't know for sure. I want to say because both Ryerson and Hutchinson and many of the individuals in this constellation of philanthropy that I alluded to, it wasn't just like they supported the Art Institute. They were involved in many different philanthropic efforts. And like Hutchinson, for example, both Hutchinson and Ryerson were very supportive of the launching of University of Chicago. I don't know specifically about the Woods, but I just would not be surprised at all if, the reach of their philanthropy reached that far.
Is there any art in the collections along the years that were part of the lost art that was found after World War II?
I'm gonna have to look into that, because that's not immediately ringing a bell for me, actually. But the collections that I've talked about today, I haven't read anything that said that, any of it was lost at any point.
Okay. Somebody wants to know, how long was it? Let me make sure I'm wording this right. Okay, so they missed this part. And how long do prints need to rest after being on display in the light?
Yep. So glad you asked. As a printmaker, I just love getting into that kind of stuff. So because prints they tend to be printed on paper, and paper gets yellow, faster than, like, say, canvas with paint. They can be on view for, I think it's something like 3, maybe 4 months, and then they must rest for 5 years minimum. So with Hokusai, we have a few copies of the Great Wave, and like I think we have maybe like 6 copies, and it's such a popular print. We just had a couple of them on view last year, and then those ones rested, but some of the other ones that didn't come out last year might come out before 6 years, if that makes sense. So it's just they need to go rest in drawers, in these flat file drawers. And so as a result, we have many more prints in storage than are on view. But under normal circumstances, we have the study room that is run by the Department of Prints and Drawings, which is, I think, one of the most magical places the whole museum is magical, but the members of the public can make appointments and requests to see any print in our collection. I mean, like, I've been in there, and a man was drawing from a Dürer print from the 1500s, which is like, that's one of the most valuable prints of all time at this point. And he's like this far away from it, drawing this print of this Dürer cow. And I'm just like, what? So the bad news is they have to rest for years. The good news is when we reopen the study room again, you can make an appointment and they'll pull it out for you, with white gloves and all this stuff, to see. I'm not sure how long. I imagine there'll, maybe be a wait and whatever, especially when we reopen that service. But I highly recommend, like, planning a trip to do that, especially if you're into prints and drawings.
Cool. I think we'll take a few more questions and then we'll wrap up, guys. So lots of people are commenting on how knowledgeable you are and very interested in knowing how long did you study all of this, and your degree is probably in art history, they say.
Oh, well, thank you, everyone. I will say that I gave a previous version of this talk, which was much more, I did a lot of research that was a lot more about the early years, so like the Hutchinson, Ryerson kind of era. And it was much more, that was for an academic audience, or, for college and graduate student audience. And so, when I kind of looked at that and thought about this occasion, I thought, okay, well, I want this to be more art forward, less like a history lecture per se. So I had done, just in my capacity as educator, done a lot of research, about the history of the founding years. And there's a lot more, to say about sort of the motivations of the people who launched the Art Institute that I think is fascinating. And also things like the relationship between business and art, and how a lot of the people, I alluded to this in the talk, but how a lot of, like, sort of the philanthropists or business people who were invested in the launch of the museum, it was tied up with wanting to really elevate Chicago, right? Like, as more than just a trading post. And so just sort of the mix of motivations they had that was both civic minded as well as somewhat self-serving, it wasn't just like purely out of the goodness of their hearts. There was a lot going on in Chicago at the time of, like, there was an influx of immigration and somewhat of a sort of power struggle where, it was a struggle to command civic authority, all these things. The development of museums and universities at the time, they weren't just like purely philanthropic. They were sort of driven by this need to sort of hold on to the reins of where Chicago was going as a city. So anyway, to answer the question though, I think as an educator, one of the best parts of my work is we have the time and the freedom to do research in what interests us. So like I mentioned about the Twombly talk, or about the talk with music and Renoir, or about this history of collecting, it's sort of like no two of us would give the same talk, because probably I'm like doing the research and asking the questions I'm most interested in. But my degree, it's in art history and creative writing. So my focus is specifically on sort of translating the research in a way that is, communicable to a broad audience and engages a broad audience that isn't necessarily like thinking about art all day long. It's more just about bringing more and more people to engage with the collection and with the museum. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but yeah.
I think you did. Let's see. Got time for one more question. So lots of people are also wondering, how can they see the Monet exhibit? It's only up until June 14th, and they're worried because you guys are closed.
Oh no, we're open. Okay. Like in general. We are closed Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and all that information will be on. I'm realizing we're just on this Martin Ryerson slide randomly. But that information will all be on the visit page as far as hours and the wait times. I can tell you that the weekends, from what I hear, the weekends have been selling out consistently. We reopened in February for the second time during the pandemic, and things have been great as far as the couple of times I've been back recently. I think it's much easier to social distance at the museum than say at the grocery store. And so I would say if you can at all get there during the week, closed Tuesdays and Wednesdays, but if you can get there Monday or Thursday, that you have a much better chance, of having a shorter wait, and maybe also not having a full gallery, which for us right now is 25% of normal. So even the full right now is not going to be that full. But if you can take a day off and get downtown during the week, I think that so we are open, and the show's up till June 14th. And also don't worry too much, because after the show closes, the collection works will go back, after they've been conserved a little bit and maybe briefly rusted. But they're so popular, they'll go back to like the permanent galleries in Impressionism. But a lot of the show is, I think the main benefit of the show is that there's so many works that came out of private collections for this show. And we do a Monet show every like 2 or 3 decades. So it is kind of a special occasion to see, some of the credit lines, like people prefer to stay anonymous. So we don't even know who owns them. I mean, we as in like me and all of us don't know, but the curators know. So it is a pretty special occasion to see works that are usually not accessible to the public. But you can still see the Monets and other works in their regular positions after the show ends.
All right, good to know. Yeah, guys, I think with that, it's about 17 after. We're going to wrap up. Thank you guys for being such an attentive audience. And thank you again, Nancy. That was truly enjoyable. I hope those of you that are still hanging out will fill out that short survey for us. And I hope to see a bunch of you next week when we visit the Field Museum. Thanks, Nancy. Everybody have a great day. Thank you, Raz.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye, all.